Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to wait a few minutes for people to join, but if you've joined already, feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat function. We'll probably start around 3 minutes past. Some great chat going on. I'm very excited too. Thank you, Johnny. Right, I think we've got a good amount of people joined now, so I'm going to start and welcome everybody to Regen's Network Charging webinar. I'm Poppy Maltby, the chair of the event. I'm a senior manager at Regen. We've been following the Ofgem process for what feels like quite a long time, and over the summer we've been helping SB Energy Networks understand what it might mean for their businesses. And we've set this up because Ofgem are getting close to a minded to decision about access and forward-looking charging, but not quite as close as we were anticipating when we set up this webinar. So for those that aren't already aware, the minded to decision and consultation is going to be happening next year now, hopefully early next year, rather than the end of this one. But hopefully there'll still be some really interesting things in the webinar from John and some of our panelists. So just some notes on Zoom before we start. We're going to be recording the session and circulating this afterwards. So if you can't stay for the whole thing, then you'll be able to catch up. We'll also be sending out the slides. There are 2 Zoom functions that you're free to use. The chat function, I see some people have already put some comments into chat. So if you've want to say something to other participants or have any technical issues, then please raise that in chat. We're going to have Q&A, the Q&A functions for questions. A quick caveat, we're not sure how much time we're going to have, but I will attempt to feed them into the discussion and questions that we'll have. Any that we don't address, we will take away at the end. So if you could use those 2, that would be great. Onto our agenda. Let that slide come up. Thanks, Hannah. So we've got 2 objectives for the session today, really. One is to help you understand some of the issues and opportunities from the review and be prepped to respond to the consultation when it arrives. And a bonus objective for today, given the delay, is that there are still areas that Ofgem need more evidence and are hoping that some of you might be able to provide that to them. Our agenda is quite simple. It's going to be part presentation, part interview. You'll be hearing first from John Parker, who's the head of Electricity Network Access Projects at Ofgem. And following John, you're going to hear from our panel, who are going to be responding with their views, highlighting any challenges and opportunities for their businesses. The first panel member will be Graham Campbell, who's head of Distribution System Operations at SP Energy Networks. Then we'll hear from Paul Hewitt, Chief Executive Officer of Belltown Power UK, and then Robin Lucas, who's Head of Data Science at Open Energy. I'm going to be asking each speaker a couple of questions after they've finished giving us their views. But before we kick off, we'd like to ask you a quick question to help you understand understand how much you already know about this. we're aware it can be quite complex. So we're going to attempt to avoid any acronyms and try and keep this high level, avoid going down too many rabbit holes of detail. So the question's up now. How much do you already know about the proposals in the Access and Forward-Looking Charges SCR? Do you know nothing? Do you know very little? Do you have some knowledge, or do you have a lot of knowledge? If you could just put your answer in, submit that, that will help me and the speakers calibrate what they're going to be talking about. So I'll give you a few moments to answer that. It shouldn't be too hard to do. Okay, let's see. Great, so we're somewhere in the middle, but there is a few that know nothing. So hopefully we won't get too complex for the people that have a little bit of knowledge. But that is sort of where we were expecting. So we're going to try and keep this a bit high level and discuss some of the principles and some of the issues with John and our panelists. So without any more ado, I'm going to hand over to John Parker. He's going to be taking us through some slides to introduce the context and the key areas of the Access SCR. John.
Hi everyone, and thanks very much for the opportunity to talk today. So yeah, I'm head of electricity network access at Ofgem, and I've been working on this project for a couple of years now. So I think I've pitched it about right, hopefully. So if we can go to the next slide. What I was going to do is spend a couple of slides just explaining some of the context, and then I'll take you through in more detail what we're considering in these proposals. So we have had running a bunch of reform programs on electricity network access and charging, quite a lot of which are led by Ofgem, but some has also been led by industry and the electricity system operator. And these are really driven at the fact that as the system is transforming, our old set of charging arrangements were not really driving. They weren't set up to give us the best outcomes for consumers. So they were in some ways creating sort of distortions, and they also weren't giving us good signals about actually how can we reduce costs in future. And so if I quickly explain the different elements of it. So what we're talking about today is the access and forward-looking charging reforms. So these are when we have network charges, these are the elements that are signaling or reflecting how someone's behavior could cause costs on the network in future. So we're talking about this today. There's also an element of network charging that is about making sure that the network companies can recover their allowed revenues, which also allow them to reflect that they've spent money in the past on building and maintaining the network. And so they need to be able to recover sort of a total allowed revenue that we set as part of our price control of them. And so there's something called residual charges, which top them up to that level. And the targeted charging review has been a project that we ran to think about how those residual charges could be recovered, because we were concerned that the way they were being collected was allowing some customers to avoid paying them and putting too high a burden on other customers. And so we've taken forward reforms to those. We have now made our decisions on them, and it's with industry to implement those proposals. And then the final area of charging is around balancing services. So these are the balancing services are the actions taken by the electricity system operator to manage the system, both in terms of balancing energy on a second-by-second basis and also managing network constraints in real time. So they have to pay users to turn up and down to manage those, and they need to recover those costs. The industry have been leading work to review how balancing services charges are structured as well. And there have been a couple of task force looking at that, which are looking at moving the burden away from generators paying to them being recovered through consumers, and then not being recovered on a half-hourly basis, but as a bit more of a steady, predictable charge. And so we are now considering the conclusions of that second task force, and we'll be publishing our view on the way forward soon. So that's the overview. And from now on, I will talk about focusing on the access SCR. So we launched this review because we recognize that in future there's going to be big new loads on the network, lots of new electric vehicles, heat pumps, lots more distributed generation, renewable distributed generation. And we wanted to make sure that all of those loads that are all about supporting net zero can be accommodated, but in doing so, they can also be recognizing that there is scope to reduce the pressure on the network and make better use of the existing network if we can get them connecting and using the system in a more effective way. So we wanted to improve the signals that you get through network charges to actually reflect how different choices can impact on network costs in the future. And we also wanted to look at actually the access arrangements. So if I just sort of run through what we mean by access arrangements first. So these are the arrangements when you connect to the network, you essentially are agreeing a level of access that you have, and that could be to export onto your network if you're a generator, or to import. And generally people would get pretty plain access rights, which mean you might ask for a maximum capacity, and that's fixed year round, and you would generally expect to have that much, have the ability to import or export at those times. But actually there's scope for having more sophisticated choices, and that's what we want to look at, as to whether you could have more choice around that kind of access to help people help make better use of the existing network. And we're actually, the industry, so the networks are also looking at how access rights are allocated as well alongside our work. So they've been looking at can there be scope for users to trade their access rights at certain times, particularly under some of the access right choices where some users could be curtailed, and I'll come on to this. Could you trade with another party to reduce your level of curtailment? So they're looking at that alongside our work. And then forward-looking charges, there are different types of charges. So there's, when you connect to networks, there's upfront charges for that connection, and we are looking at the arrangements for connecting to the distribution network, so those charges, because we're looking at actually whether they're sort of charging too much in terms of they cover the costs they charge for any reinforcement needed, and so we're looking at whether that continues to be right in future. And then there are also ongoing charges for using the network. So there's distribution network DUOS, which is short for distribution use of system charges. So the ongoing use of the distribution networks, and the equivalent at transmission level. And we're considering both of those within our review. Now, just worth saying that these charges are generally paid by large generators and suppliers. And then, so customers a lot of the time won't pay these directly. They won't necessarily be that aware of them, but suppliers will factor them into their tariff decisions. And so if we can improve the signals to suppliers, then suppliers can act on those. And they may act on them by creating sort of pass-through tariffs. So you could have a sort of a time of use tariff they introduce for customers, or what we're seeing some suppliers do is they're actually still having a flat tariff, but they're offering inducements to customers to say, actually, well, if you allow us to optimize some of your loads, for example, your electric vehicle charging, then we'll give you a discount, or we'll give you some sort of other reward. And so the supplier is still managing a lot of the complexity, and it's pretty simple for the customer. So if we move on again. So in a second, I'll talk more about the actual options we're considering, and I'll spend most of my time on that, but it's worth me just outlining the overall process we're going through as well. So we launched the SCR a couple of years ago now, and it's a complex area, and hopefully I will mask a lot of that complexity for you today. But it's taken quite a lot of time for us in the industry to work through the different options. And what we did at first was think about the long list of reform options, and we then shortlisted those for more detailed consideration in February this year. And since then, we've been working up those short list of options in more depth, so fleshing out how they would work and then assessing them. And our assessment is principally going to be qualitatively based against some guiding principles, which are those on the left. So we want options that help support more efficient system development, but we also want options that reflect that energy as an essential service, which includes the fact that actually, if particularly for those in vulnerable situations, if we are seeing significant increases in tariffs, and that could lead to bad outcomes. And we also want options that are practically, we can practically implement within reasonable timeframes. So we're aiming for to be able to implement these changes by 2023 or 2024, say, and that the amount of change needed to implement them is proportionate to the sort of overall benefits as well. And so we're having a principles-led assessment, but we are having that supported by modelling as well. So we've commissioned SEPA TNEI, who are some economic and engineering consultants, to model the impact of the options we're considering out into the future, and to try and to give some insights as to what kind of behaviour changes that might generate, what kind of system benefits that could then generate as well. So what network savings it might create, what might be the impact on the generation mix, and the cost of achieving a certain level of decarbonisation. The reason that is not sort of the principal basis of our decision making is because there's a lot of uncertainty in undertaking that modelling. There's quite a lot of assumptions you need to make. So we think it can give some insights, but we think we need to be careful not to put too much weight on it. And as Poppy alluded to, we have recently changed our timing. So we had been planning to put out a consultation next month, setting out our draft, so our minded to proposals and our draft impact assessment. But we've actually now decided to delay that for a little while, to allow us to do a bit more thinking about some elements, particularly around sort of what the future framework for encouraging the flexibility we need in future is, and making sure that our access proposals are fully aligned with that. So we are pushing back that minded to into next year. We don't have a definite sort of month we're aiming to at the moment, but we're hoping to put that out in shortly, a bit more of a detailed timeline on that. Okay, so we're going to go to the next slide. So this covers the options we're considering in each area. So if I just step through. So in terms of the ongoing distribution charges that suppliers pay on behalf of everyone, and generators also face, at the moment, within distribution charges, for most customers, we have there's a single charging zone per DNO region. So there's 14 DNO regions around the country, and each one has a single charging zone. Now, we think that as the system is becoming more decentralized and we're getting more generation connecting at distribution level, and also as the growth of low carbon technologies is driving the need for more reinforcement in different areas, we think that actually having a single charging zone is going to mask some quite important differences between areas. So there could be some areas of a network, of a DNO's network, where actually it's generation that's starting to drive the need for reinforcement rather than demand. Or it could be that actually there's some areas of a network where demand is going to be driving reinforcement very, very soon, whereas actually there's lots of spare capacity in other areas of a network. So actually, if you could encourage some users, like a new business that's going to be investing in an EV fleet, to charge their fleet in locations where there's more capacity, then you can reduce the need to reinforce the network. So we think actually if you introduce more zones, you can reflect that better. And so we're looking at increasing the number of charging zones. Now, the maximum we're looking at is 6,000, which is quite a lot more than the 14 we have now. That reflects that within the distribution networks, there's tiers of different voltages, essentially. So if you kind of think about it as the road network, then sort of transmission network is the motorways, and then you have trunk roads, and you get smaller and smaller roads. And the same principle applies in distribution networks. And so there's something called a primary substation, which is the boundary between what's called the extra high voltage bit of the distribution network and the high voltage. And there's 6,000 of those primary substations around the country. So that would be the maximum granularity we have. So customers under one primary substation could get different charges to ones under a neighbouring one. But we are looking at maybe bundling up a bit further, so you could have, say, 800 zones instead. And what we would have is that the charges in those locations could vary according to the cost of the network and of building new network in those areas, or the level of spare capacity, and also with is it generation or demand driving reinforcement needs. And actually that isn't just a sort of simple binary choice, because the charges will also vary for different time periods as well. So it could be that there's one area that in the summer has a lot of solar PV, and so during the summer lunch times, it's generation dominated, and so generation would face a charge at those times. Demand could face a credit for if it can mop up that generation locally. Whereas in the winter, it could still be a demand driven area, which is close to reinforcement driven by traditional or new EV loads, for example. And so during those periods, demand would face a charge at that time. So what we're trying to get is a more sophisticated approach that better reflects how network cost drivers is varying in different times and locations. Now, it's definitely worth emphasizing here that we're very conscious that introducing more locational granularity particularly is going to have some distributional impacts, and we're very cognizant of those, especially for small users. And as I said, we're quite concerned to understand the impact for vulnerable users. So it may be that we might end up with an approach which introduces some of this extra granularity for larger users, but for small users, it sort of still has a greater degree of averaging of the location granularity. So that's the sort of thing we're looking at as well. Moving on to the charges for connecting to the distribution network. So as I mentioned earlier, at the moment, if you're connecting somewhere on the distribution network and that would need reinforcement to the wider network to facilitate it, then your connection charge will ask you to pay. You'll be asked to pay for some of that for your connection charge. We are looking at whether we should reduce the extent to which that is charged through the connection charge, or potentially even remove it entirely, so that the connection charge would only be about a user's sole use assets that's needed to sort of essentially connect them to the existing network when they're connecting. And the reason we're looking at that is we have concerns that this may be a barrier to entry for new users, particularly for the low carbon technologies that we see as being needed in future, renewables generation, EVs, charging points, and those sort of things. So we are looking at that. We also think that actually the current arrangements lead DNOs to be quite reactive to new connections. They wait to reinforce until they get a connection that triggers it. And actually, if you make the arrangement shallower, maybe they can then help them be more holistic and strategic in starting to reinforce the network ahead of need, rather than reacting to those needs emerging. Moving on to transmission charges. So this is a slightly less fundamental review of transmission charges than we are doing of distribution charges. So we're looking at quite a narrow change to the charges for demand under transmission, where so I'm conscious of avoiding being too technical, but the charges are currently based on what are called triad periods, which are the three highest sort of half-hourly demand periods in the winter across the system, and they are not necessarily very actually reflective of what's driving costs of the transmission on the transmission network. So whilst that's the system peak where most generation is needed, is not necessarily the point where we have most constraints on the transmission network. And so we are looking at whether that can be improved, potentially by moving to what we're calling seasonal triads, where you could have a triad during the winter still, which there's some charges in, but also for sort of a year-round triad as well. Or we could move to what's more like what we have in distribution, where we have charges which are sort of, there's fixed periods, say red, amber, green, where red period is 4 to 7 during winter weekdays. So it could be the higher charges. And then for distributed generation, we are looking at a change as well, which is, so at the moment distributed generation can get credits under transmission charges, where they're so transmission charges pay generators in some areas of a network where they're helping offset loads. So broadly, that's the more south you go, that happens. and distributed generation can get those credits as well as large generators in those areas. But at the moment, what we don't see is distributed generators facing the same charges in areas where large generators are facing charges. So this is particularly in Scotland, where generation that comes on there does lead to increased flows over the network to down south. At the moment, the charges are capped at 0, so distributed generation are not facing charges, and we're looking at should that cap be removed and they start being charged on the same basis as the large generators. So the aim of this would be to create a level playing field for new generation, for new renewables. We know a lot of the new generation will be renewables or low carbon, and so the aim would be so that actually it causes a distortion in that actually one particular category of generation is essentially getting an implicit subsidy at the moment, and so we think if we remove this, we'd level the playing field, and then competition should drive the most efficient whole system outcome, reflecting that actually, yes, there may be load factors for wind or solar might be slightly less, but actually if they can connect further south, then they can reduce network flows, and overall we think that could reduce the cost of getting to net zero. Now we recognise this is quite a hot topic and widely debated, so it's something we'll be analysing carefully. And also we recognise there are potential issues for existing generators who have already located and can't now move. So we will be thinking about transition arrangements for this change as well. And then the final area is around improving the definition and choice of access rights. So this is kind of yes, people may be familiar that there have been quite a lot of non-firm or flexible access rights being made use of at distribution to allow people to connect quicker and avoid connection charges because they're avoiding the need to reinforce the network. And we think that's been, in many ways, it's been a good thing, because there are lots of users who have been able to connect that wouldn't otherwise have been able to. But we do recognise that the way they've been designed has created quite an open-ended risk for those that are on those flexible access rights. So we're looking at improving those rights by putting on a cap as to the amount of curtailment and giving users choices to what level of curtailment they'd be willing to accept, for example. We're also looking at introducing something called time profiled rights. So this is the idea that some users won't need 24/7, 365 days a year access at the same level. And so if that's quite predictable, then they might be able to say, okay, well, look, I don't need, it could be a solar farm, for example, saying, I don't need much access during winters at 4 till 7. And so if they were to do that, and that helps reduce the need for reinforcement, and that can allow them to get onto the system quicker and allows us to effectively share the access, sort of the network capacity better around users. Final thing to mention on this is we have had a lot of people saying that what we need at distribution for access rights is the equivalent to what we have for transmission, which is that we have something called financially firm rights, and if there are network reinforcement needed, then there's something called connect and manage, which means that the system operator can allow people to connect, and they will manage those constraints through basically taking flexibility actions, and the generator will be kept. If a generator needs to be curtailed off, they'll be financially compensated for that. So first thing to say is any distributed generation connecting can qualify for that in relation to transmission level constraints. We have looked at whether it could be extended to distribution level constraints as well, and at this stage we think we can't. That's not something that we can implement in the near term. We think there's quite a lot of thinking about what kind of network planning standards you would need around that to make sure that the risks of the level of cost to consumers would face it would be acceptable. And so that's something we think merits consideration in the slightly longer term, but we're not taking it forward for this significant code review. Okay, if I go to the next slide. So just very quickly, so yeah, as I've said, we will be consulting next year on our MIDA2 proposals, so that'll be a key time to input. But yeah, we do now have a bit more time before we come up with those, and there are some areas where we would and we'd like feedback on any of these elements that we're talking about, but there's some particular areas where further evidence would be quite helpful to us in firming up our views. So for example, in terms of, where would you find that additional location or time granularity in the charges would help unlock value in your projects? Do you have any experience or evidence of connection charges hindering your project connections, and particularly the charge, because there's been a high charge relating to reinforcement needs? Because what we found so far is, I guess we haven't had as much clear evidence that this is causing a barrier to people as we expected we might. And then in terms of the impact of these changes on existing projects, particularly in relation to those transmission charging changes, do you have evidence on that, how that could adversely impact you? And that would inform our thinking. So we've got an email there that you can get in touch with us at. And also, if you would like to hear more, then the Charging Futures forum, which is run by the electric system operator, does do regular updates and sort of teachings and stuff like that. So if you are interested in more information, please do sign up to that as well.
Thank you, John. That was really good. It's great to have that sort of run through. I'll just start my video so you can see me. So I'm just going to ask a couple of questions. We've got a few minutes to get some clarifications. I think just to start really with the title of the event, we would like to explore whether we think the proposals as a whole are going to support or detract from decarbonisation. And I guess from our perspective, that means, does it help us build more renewable generation? Does it help us electrify more demand? Does it help us improve opportunities for flexibility and balance the system? So it would be good to get your view on where you think the review supports decarbonisation, and also any areas that you think perhaps at the moment don't, and whether or not there are some plans for mitigation of that impact. Just to note some of the questions, but also about, the objectives of the review don't mention decarbonisation explicitly, but they're there implicitly, I believe. So perhaps a quick comment on that would be good.
Yeah, sure. So I guess, Ofgem as a whole, we are, helping achieve decarbonisation at least cost is a key strategic outcome we're aiming to do. But I think the at least cost is a really important rider, because and an area where a lot of the debate is. So I think there's some elements of our changes that are just about removing barriers to potential barriers, which around sort of the connection charging changes or access rights. Well, actually, I think they're fairly clear. If we were to go down this route, they're helpful to decarbonisation. I think where it gets more contentious is around some of the changes about transmission charging, and we are exposing people to more signals, where our thinking in doing that is that that will create better signals, a better whole system outcome, in that people will be able to take into account the network costs in how they're accessing the network, and then as a result, what comes forward will be a more efficient whole system outcome while still meeting net zero. And I think we are cognizant that does mean, for example, that say the transmission charging changes, we recognise that could mean that there's a need for increased CFD funding. But if that, our expectation is that would be outweighed by the reduction in network costs, and so overall we get a more efficient and cheaper way of getting to net zero. But it's a bit more nuanced than just sort of the removing barriers area. And just to pick up finally on the point around objectives, you're absolutely right. It is implicit within there. It's a fundamental driver for starting this review was looking ahead and what is needed for the net zero and the energy system transformation. And then in terms of our guiding principles, it's because we're looking at decarbonisation at least cost, it is within our sort of economic efficiency principle that we're picking up that.
Great. So it's interesting that you mentioned about the whole system. That was sort of one of the questions I had prepared, essentially, is that I think one of the questions we've raised in the past is that the remit, of course, for this is constrained to mainly distribution electricity network rather than a whole energy system. So if you're sort of optimizing your your access at the distribution level only, you may be missing some of the other impacts. So I guess you could drive down network costs to a least cost, but other areas may go up. Or similarly, you might expect in a net zero system, the network costs are going to be more expensive, but the electricity price will be lower. How have you, I know you'd be aware of that in what you've been doing. How have you tried to reflect that in your thinking? Is there a recognition that network costs and balancing costs and these charges are likely to go up in the net zero system, but be compensated by other areas perhaps going down?
I mean, our expectation is that, I think we would expect balancing costs to go up because of the challenges of intermittent. I don't think that's so linked to this project. In terms of network charges, in terms of sort of the distribution and transmission ones, I think what we'd expect to see is that network charges will go up less than they would otherwise do as a result of these changes. So we do expect them to go up, but because we're making better use of the system and having to undertake less investment, then they go up less than otherwise. Just say, a bit more about the whole system. Our modelling is trying to look at, it is looking at generation as well, and operational impacts of our changes and what that means for the generation mix. You have to be very, very cautious about how you use that sort of modelling when it goes that so far and there's so much going on. But one of the things they will look at is, I guess to achieve, so they're basing it on the first scenario and say they're looking at how much, if we see some shift in sort of locations of generation, for example, how much more sort of funding would you need through the wholesale market or through CFDs to be able to achieve the same level of decarbonised generation? So that's definitely one thing we're keen to understand and look at.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. We've got only a few more minutes before I need to move on, but I think it would be good to ask you if you could give us any more sneak previews of your roadmap. So one of the things that, as we've been going through, there are areas that you haven't, for practicality reasons or timescale reasons, been able to go through into this, in this SCR. I don't want to depress you too much, obviously, John, because you got your work cut out with this one, but looking a little bit further ahead, what other things are on that? What might be on that roadmap? We've talked about financially firm, potentially. Are there other areas you're going to put out to the long grass, if that's not the right?
We definitely don't think this is a one-shot game. In that, I think we will be making some quite significant changes here, but there will definitely, I think, need to be further changes in the future. I think the problem is, so the sort of thing we could look at in future is, as you get better monitoring of the networks, you could move to sort of more dynamic sort of time of use signals. So at the moment, we're proposing that the charges will be set, say the charge bands will be set a year in advance, and there'll be 4 till 7 or whatever, and those charges will be set. Now, one option could be that actually, as you can monitor the networks and we get better forecasting as well, then you could be saying, look, actually, we think there's going to be a high constraints will be very high tomorrow, and you set your high charging periods more dynamically. So that's one option, but it's very much tied up in what I talked about when I said why we're delaying this project, is that there's a lot of ways that you could sort of move in terms of the future framework for valuing flexibility in future. There are you could rely more on flexibility markets run by DNOs and ESO, which we expect will get smarter over time, for example. So whether you try and use the role of charging in the future does depend on what you think of that overall picture. So I gave you an example, but that's definitely not a sort of a nailed uncertainty to be in that roadmap. Okay,
thanks, John. So now we've heard from John, we're going to ask our panel to reflect on some of the challenges and opportunities that the proposal might present for them. And first up, we've got Graham from SP Energy Networks. Their DNOs are obviously the key stakeholder in this process. A lot of the review is essentially about how distribution networks are going to develop and price those services for their customers. So over to Graham.
Thank you, Poppy, and thank you, John, for the overview. And it's great to be here and seeing so many attendees on the session this afternoon. So I'm going to spend a few minutes giving a perspective from a DNO, a distribution network operator, who will see significant changes and potential impacts from some of the proposals that are put forward. I'm going to cover 3 areas. I'll look at effectively an overview of what I think it means for us. I'll talk a little bit about where I think the opportunities are, and then I'll finish by outlaying some of the concerns that we have with respect to the proposed changes, although of course there's still much to be discussed and a minded to position to be issued. But ultimately, and I'm sure this is apparent from the narrative that John has taken you through, that this will result in quite significantly increased complexity across all facets of the review, if you like. So that complexity will need to take account of far greater modelling of the network, both in terms of demand and generation than we do today. It will increase complexity around the infrastructure that we need to deploy and the investment that we need to make. But crucially, it will help us inform that investment. And I've been following with interest the discussion in the Q&A, and we need to recognise that investment in order to achieve net zero and to meet the needs of customers is essential. We will not achieve net zero with the network as it is today, particularly down at the lower voltages. High quality communication and engagement is critical, and I would urge you all on this call to engage in the process of the consultation in the minded to position, because there could be some quite significant impacts on individual customers. And whilst I admire the intention, I think the practical realities of what it will mean might be quite different. So actually, does what is intended play through in practice? And that's a question I'd like you to think about through the discussion I'm just about to have. And for ourselves as a DNO, we need to build resource and capability. I think most of you know that for very long now, the distribution network, certainly the lower voltage, has been fit and forget. It was designed to accommodate the demand it served, and it has done so incredibly well over the years. 99.9% reliability. Few customers do experience outages, and when they do, they're back on supply very, very quickly. But the world is changing, and it's not just about the locational prices, it's not just about the connection boundary, it's physically about the capability of the assets serving people's homes. And we need to think about that, and we need to think about the impact that the uptake of low carbon technologies has. That said, there are opportunities undoubtedly. Improving the utilisation of the existing system in areas where there are constraints is to be admired, and I think we need and have an obligation to support that. Undoubtedly supports the development of DSO and flexibility markets, and for those of you who are involved with us, you'll know that we are absolutely hot on flexibility. We've issued a number of tenders. We're recently in the process of seeking flexibility for all our intended reinforcement projects in the next price control period, which runs from 2023 to 2028. So we're putting signals out to the market already about investment in flexibility, investment in assets to ensure that we can minimise the cost to the consumer. And ultimately, if we get this right, and a point I guess to John and the Ofgem team is that if you play this into the negotiation with price controls, and you do take account of the investment needed to meet net zero and some of the mechanisms that we need to put in place around things like strategic investment, we could and should lower network costs. But that process and mechanism needs to be right. That, however, does bring me on to some concerns, some of which you may already have taken from the discussion that John put forward, but there is likely increased cost for existing customers. Of particular concern to ourselves is large demand customers connected at extra high voltage. They are likely to see quite significant price increases. And that gives me huge cause for concern, particularly within the environment they're working in and the real financial pressure that organisations and individuals are under. And there are also some suggestions that some low voltage customers may well see quite significant price increases as well, albeit that detail will come out through the consultation process, but from the work that's already been done, we do have some concerns of quite significant price increases for customers. Of greatest concern to me is that I think that proposed in some of the discussion you've heard already could render any investment in renewables in Scotland worthless. The likelihood is that charges to renewables in Scotland will increase, the credits that they already see may reduce, and given the already heavily constrained areas of the network, the likelihood is that any investment in renewables will reduce dramatically in an area that has huge remaining sources of renewables. And that's something that we need to think about. Again, I talk about admiring the intention, but we equally need to look at the practicalities of how the network operates, what resources are available, and where these projects are best sited. And with that, I then worry about the unintended consequences. These are not foreseen, and we may suffer the consequences of that. So rather than achieving the desired outcomes, in actual fact, we may see in certain areas increases in costs. And again, we talk about trying to attract investment, whether generation or demand, into areas that either have a constraint associated with the other. But is that really what's going to happen in practice? Is someone seeking to build a factory in Liverpool suddenly going to move to the Lake District because there's generation constraints or there's demand available, and equally so in other areas of the network? So I think the practicalities of what's intended, how it will play through in reality, and crucially the impact on customers is unknown, and it makes it very difficult for us as DNOs to forecast the investments that we need to make in the right areas to enable net zero. So I guess the question I leave you with, or the thought I leave you with, is, does the work that's been done to date really help us achieve net zero? Okay, Poppy.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Graham. So I had a couple of questions. I'm aware we want to give our other panelists enough time, but so you mentioned the strategic network investment, and John did that as well. This is something that we've all been talking about and hoping for, but do you think that this review will improve that situation? That is a hope. How do you see that playing out on your networks?
So I think if the mechanisms are worked on between network companies, Ofgem and stakeholders, and the right processes are put in place, then yes, I do think some aspects of the SCR could help with the strategic investment question. I do, however, have a concern that the uncertainty around some of the charging and the impact that will have on existing and new customers, as well as some of the access arrangements, may mean that encouraging, if you like, strategic investment in certain areas might be very difficult. And I use the renewables example in Scotland. So in theory, and given the experiences that I've had, significantly more renewables might have been connected in Scotland had a shallower connection boundary been used in the past. So if a shallow connection boundary is used in the future, you might think that would then encourage further renewables. But for the reasons I've already outlined, given the increased likelihood of increased charges, as well as some of the issues around constraint management, then I would actually argue that we wouldn't want to strategically invest for renewables in Scotland, because the likelihood is that won't be forthcoming. So on one hand, I say yes, but the reality, given the uncertainty around all aspects of SCR, I think it becomes very challenging to support strategic investment with that direction. Poppy.
Yes, I see that. I guess looking at on the other perspective, so on your demand impact, a lot of this should also help electrification of demand. The shallow or the cheaper connection charges will also impact people that want to have EV charging and electrified heat. We spoke to some of your connections team over the summer. One mentioned they were fitting their second EV charger in a street, and they thought that in 3 years' time they might be the 5th or the 20th, which might give you sleepless nights, I imagine. Does the TCR and SCR together make that less frightening for you? Do you think the potential for the demand increases?
I think we need to look at the hard realities and the physics of the system. Poppy, and let's not forget that we're dealing here with a system that is bound by the laws of physics, right? And they're uncompromising for those that aren't familiar. But ultimately, we know that for any third or fourth customer in any typical street that seeks to install an EV charging, if there isn't the right price signals, there isn't the right supply arrangements in place, the likelihood is that that network will not be able to support all chargers fully charging vehicles at the same time. So investment is necessary. Investing at the right time, though, is crucial. So I think some of the locational prices might help that, but I doubt very much if that will, to the extent, make one customer over another choose to get an electric vehicle or otherwise. I think if a customer wishes an electric vehicle, then they will go for it, whether they're in an area with a highly constrained or a high demand and therefore paying a little bit more versus an area that's got less demand paying a little bit less. You've got to remember that in terms of network charging in our area, customers typically pay 30 pence a day for the services that we provide. So even a few pence up or down on that, I don't think is really going to impact whether a customer purchases an electric vehicle or not. The key issue for the rollout of electric vehicles in domestic properties is investment. Investment at the right time, because investment in LV networks takes at least 6 months and it's disruptive. It's people's drives, it's people's homes, it's people's gardens. So I think, yes, in theory, in practice, I think it'll be quite different, Poppy.
I think that's probably like a bit of a mantra for the review, isn't it? Yes, in theory. Let's see what it looks like in practice. Thank you, Graham. I'm going to move on to Paul now to give his view. This, number one of our list on decarbonisation is, are we going to get more renewable generation built? We've seen really explosive growth, and now we're seeing really a slow to a trickle of new sites. Some of that is down to network issues, we understand. So it'd be good to hear from Paul about what this might do for his business.
Thanks, Poppy. Thanks everyone so far. Yeah, so for me, the key thing that we need to remember is that we're always talking about a transition, right? We're talking about an energy transition, and we all know that we've got to go through a transition from how we generated electricity 20 years ago to how we must do so in kind of 30 years' time, and I think now we've got a pretty good picture of what the majority of generation and consumption is going to look like in 2030, 2040, even 2050. It looks like, from a generation perspective, it looks like a lot of offshore wind in the north and east. It looks like a lot of onshore wind in Scotland and Wales. It looks like a lot of solar, primarily smaller sites located in the south where there's limited land and planning space to be able to put large sites. And then from a demand perspective, it's significant additional electrical vehicles and electrified heating, and then storage and flexibility in between to make all that balance. And I think we all do acknowledge that the current grid is not designed for the optimal setup of that future. It's designed based on how we generated and consumed electricity in the past. But from my perspective, where demand is located is pretty fixed in the long run. So cities don't move over periods of 30, 40 years, and also where maximum generation potential is pretty fixed in the long run as well in the future, because that's mostly determined by weather patterns and by areas of natural beauty and by population centers themselves as well. And hopefully weather patterns won't change too much over the next 30, 40 years that changes. Cross fingers that the south of England doesn't turn into hurricane season. But I know that grid infrastructure does have a shelf life, right? Grid infrastructure does need to be replaced over time, and I think that if we incentivize new generation to locate based on what's best for current grid infrastructure, that just leads to a perpetual cycle of projects being built where there's grid and grid replacements then being made where those projects have been built. And so I think John and the team are treading that careful balance between ensuring what's lowest cost for current consumers and transitioning to a system that then creates the kind of most optimal outcome for future consumers. So So when I look at the proposals, the options that have been taken forward, and hearing the team talk and sort of reading between the lines on where the thinking is going on the SCR, I think using the ultra long run charging modules for TNOS with limited cost, upfront cost for connections that we've had for a while, works well, because it signals to the developer the long run cost of connecting into the grid, without putting onerous on them for paying for the the immediate change that them connecting has on the system. So for me, I think the most important part of the SCR is sort of driving that logic down into distribution level connections as well. And so there's a lot of talk about grid signaling to demand and generation, about how they should act. But I think it's equally, if not more important, for generation to be able to signal to grid as to what needs to happen. And so for me, I think the changing to an ultra long run charging model for DUOS, generated DUOS, is a good step in that direction. And I think for me, a shallow boundary combined with that allows that to happen. It also allows DNOs to act more strategically in what solutions they put in place to improve the grid going forward, rather than simply that being developer funded upgrades, project specific focus upgrades. So I think in reality, when we develop wind and solar across the country, and I think most of what the SCR is doing will have impacts on solar more than wind. I think it's those are the majority of the distribution connections that will be needed, and it is viable grid connection cost that's the major limiting factor to the deployment of solar that we need. So I think most of what John and the team are doing seems to align pretty well with where my thinking goes on us moving, decarbonising the system, but I'm definitely concerned that we might not be ambitious enough on the scope of changes that we need in grid to incentivize the grid for the future, rather than incentivize just lowest cost at the moment and connecting on. And so I think really pushing to that shallow boundary, really pushing for the most flexible access rights to allow generators to connect, will help us get there. I'm sure John and the team are taking all this into account, thinking through all these comments seriously, analysing them and factoring into their thinking. And they've obviously got many stakeholders to take account of. And it's an incredibly complex system with lots of unforeseen consequences. But I think it's really key we don't lose the sight of where we are in 30 years' time.
Thank you, Paul. That was really great. I'm sort of taking away from that link between the shallower charge and that strategic network investment, and making sure that happens in reality is really important here. And it's not just something that we talk about as hopefully going to come out, but is actually something that does. So I had a couple of questions, and the first one was really about the behavior element. I think you've touched on this already, really, but there is an underlying assumption here that the network charging can provide signals that customers and the location of new sites could be influenced by. You might have new locational signals where generators are going to face a charge rather than a credit. So how much do your business cases really pay attention to network charges, and what sort of behaviours do you think this variety of signals might elicit from you?
Yeah, that's good. I mean, we come from a background, and Belltown itself is a developer, constructor, investor, operator of renewables, and so we, right from the very beginning of developing projects, we are thinking about all of the economic aspects that are going to make a project more or less attractive to develop, right? And so absolutely, we factor in at the earliest stages grid connection charging into our thinking. In lots of instances, it's a minute part of the puzzle, and changes that John and the team are thinking of, particularly the sort of changes to duos charging at lower levels. Yes, we take that signal and it feeds into the modeling that we're doing, but it's very unlikely to change any aspects. It's just not one of the major aspects. But I think some elements, and some of my peers in the industry might hate me for saying this, but TNUOS charging in distribution connected wind projects in the north of Scotland, absolutely, that's a huge signal. And we have projects where we will look at them and we will say the wind speed on this project isn't really sufficient to support a transmission connection and pay TNUOS. But if it was a 9-turbine distribution site, well, then the economics stack up because we don't have to pay the TNUOS. And fundamentally, that is inefficient. And that doesn't make sense. And so the changes that are being proposed on the taking away the zero cap for distribution TNUOS, I think it sucks for us. Clearly, we have projects, and we knew that this was something that was potentially coming. We've factored that into the way we think about things, but fundamentally, we shouldn't be developing a 9-turbine site when there is potential to develop a 15-turbine site, just because we're being subsidised to do so. So I think that the TNUOS signal is a big signal, and that does change behaviors. I think some of the other signals, there's a lot of work going into adding that complexity to the system, and some of those signals are just they're not material in helping us decide where we develop projects.
Okay, well, thank you for your honesty. That's that's an interesting riding in the north of Scotland. I think John will be pleased to hear that. The other one is something actually I've talked about with Graham before, is that obviously the review is introducing potentially cheaper connections, a cheaper firm connection, so you can do what you like in your capacity, as well as introducing perhaps cheaper flexible connections. So you might be in the future be given a choice. Do you want a flexible connection or a shallow connection? But which are you likely to take? Are they going to play off against each other? How is that going to work?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. I think for me, I go down the route of shallower boundaries and firmer connections. But I think the main reason I do that is because the problem about having a lot of complexity and access rights is that in order for that to be able to drive our decision making, we need to have all of the optionality that creates, right? And I think in general, DNOs and the way that the connection process is set up is not really set up for DNOs to come back and say, well, look, you could have this much access right for this cost, this much access right for this cost. Here's the infinite number of possibilities that you could have. Let's sit down and discuss, and optimize this to get the most out of the system. And I think that's what these changes are intending to do. But practically, that then means that DNOs have to be able to model all the potential options that you have to be able to discuss those with you and take into account the things that we're taking into account to work out whether lower access or higher cost is going to be more viable. And I just think that doesn't, unless my concern is it will go to a situation where you can either apply for a flexible connection or a firm connection, and you apply for your flexible connection and you get back, here's the cost and here's the curtailment level, and you say, well, what do I compare that with? Is that better than a firm connection? I don't know, because I don't have the counterfactual, right? So I think the access right piece works if we're able to optimize the solution with the DNO. The problem is that adds a lot of complexity to the work that the DNO needs to do, and I'm sure that the DNOs won't be so keen on having that. I think in general, having shallower costs is a much simpler way of allowing generation not to be a generation where generation is best placed not to be to be able to connect, while at the same time keeping a signal to developers as to what the best parts of the network are to connect in.
Great, thank you, Paul. That was very interesting, and yeah, that flexible shallow is a question that obviously we've been thinking about, and whether or not the flexible is perhaps a short-term solution for something that moves to being firmer in the future. So I'm going to move on now to our last panelist, and that is Robin from Open Energy. And as John has said, the Minder 2 decision has been partly delayed because of the flexibility implications and how complex some of these interactions might be between the different types of flexibilities in markets. So luckily, Robin is here to provide clarity and talk us through how it might impact the flexibility industry.
Hopefully try and provide some clarity in this quagmire of complexity. Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me, and thanks to all the other panelists. So I was just going to sort of step through those different boxes that John had on his slide to sort of discuss the flexibility impacts and the impacts of actually operating something like an energy storage asset in the kind of new world that the review is heading towards. So with 6,000 different potential GEWIS prices, one of the key things I would say is having those prices accessible and in the same format across all regions, because it suddenly gets very, very complicated to have all of those prices, and even for suppliers as well as aggregators, to be able to accurately charge their customers. If you've got to have all of that different information, it's fairly complicated now to get the GEWIS prices in. You have to go to 14 different, well, each DNO's different website, download a different spreadsheet, find the right line. And if you've suddenly increased that complexity, many times over, that becomes very, very difficult to deal with. So I would say that we need to have all of these charges very, very transparent and in the same format, so that people like me who have to go and scrape the data can do that in an effective way. With regards to the shallower connections and upfront connection charges, whatever gives us more energy storage and more options for flex on the network is really what we're aiming for. We want to get as much flexibility out there in order to balance the system and as many places as possible. So at the moment, we've seen there's been a number of flexible tenders at distribution level. So Graham was talking about the SP flexibility tenders that they've put out. As an aggregator, we find that these are very much kind of the cherry on top of the flexibility revenue stack. If you happen to have an asset in the right place, then you can participate in those tenders, but they're quite patchy. So if we can sort of increase the coverage of those tenders, it will enable those markets to really grow and become a lot more competitive with other flexibility markets. So yeah, the shallower connection should mean that we get more storage assets on the network, and even storage assets which share sites with renewable generation. And this allows you to do a lot more co-optimization within one site. I would say that the TCR, the outcomes of the TCR and the reduction of the triad has completely hammered the business case for behind the meter storage, behind the meter flexibility and demand side response. And we need these new network charges to replace that in some fashion. And having lots of very variable tariffs is how we get there. So having lots of, even though we might have some very complex GEWIS charges, as long as we see that there is significant volatility of prices at different times of day throughout the year that is reliable and that you can build a business case on for the next 10 years, that will help sort of soak up some of the negatives of the TCR decisioning, in that we lost a lot of revenue behind the meter on flexible sites. So that is really key, particularly from a carbon perspective, to rejuvenate that whole side of the market, which at the moment is really suffering. In terms of the, so having flexible connections, so the shallow connection versus having a flexible connection, that's really just another piece of the optimization pie. So we need to be it makes our job more complex in operating these storage assets, because we have another constraint within the profiles that we have to operate between. If you can't export on a site between 4 and 7, then you suddenly have actually a better business case for putting a battery on that site, because you can soak up any wind generation, for example, during that time, and then discharge it later on. So that, I think, is very, very good for flexibility potentially. It just is additional complexity. And I really agree with Paul in that I'm not sure that at the moment DNOs would want to have that additional capability and the additional complexity that would introduce, and how those signals get transmitted to different sites and how those signals change over time. I think that is possibly a longer term outlook. So maybe if we start with shallower connections and then go towards flexible connections later on. Yeah, but anything that sort of levels out the playing field with active network management, if we reduce that and instead increase local flexibility markets, so people actually get paid for curtailment rather than it just getting curtailed and you have to factor that into your business plan up front, that is a very good thing. So it's been quite scattered as I've made notes throughout. I hope you've been able to follow me and I've made some semblance of sense. But yeah, essentially we need to really add some more layers to the revenue stack for behind the meter flexibility, and then not penalise those big in front of the meter sites. And yeah, having more local signals is a very, very good thing for flexibility, and it will obviously help towards net zero.
Thank you, Robin. Yeah, I mean, I think my takeaway from that really is that the review and the complexity of the review does open up some windows of opportunity for storage and for flexible assets behind the meter and in front of the meter. So if it's done the right way, it could or should start to increase the amount of storage being connected, we hope, and help them be more profitable. I mean, one of the questions that means that storage might be differently impacted, I guess, is that unlike renewables, they are less constrained about where to locate. Right, you're not relying on wind speed or irradiance or that much land. So the ability for storage to react to these sort of SCR signals is quite high. I mean, you could say the same with fossil fuel, actually. If sort of peaking generation might be the same. But storage should fit under that bundle of being able to move.
Yeah, I would say that you see it already, that a lot of storage projects will be placed where the GWOS rates are more volatile. So if you find that for certain locations, those locational price signals give you a much better revenue, then you will see more projects getting installed, which is only a good thing. So yeah, I agree.
And so one of the, I know you're not going to be able to answer this question fully, Robin, because this is one of the things that Ofgem are looking at themselves, this sort of flexibility roadmap, the flexibility future. Essentially, what makes me sort of put my hands to my head is how the behavior signals in the network charging, how the locational signals and the flexible connections are going to interact and be priced against the DSO work and the flexibility markets. At the moment, they're looking like sort of 4 different flexibility signals. Do you have views on how they should interact? Is it okay to have different types of flexibility signals like that, or should they sort of be able to interact and be priced so you can trade one with another?
When we're talking about flexibility signals, so we're talking about a flexible connection. Yeah. So potentially you can import at these times at this level and a different level at other times. We're also talking about like different time of use tariffs. Yeah. Which are applied all of the time. What's the other 2?
So the procured flexibility, so the type that that spend might do, so they might go out to get
procured tendered flexibility,
flexibility, and then should you as a flexible connection be able to trade away, like John was saying, that in a different market.
And then you have to layer on top of that national flexibility markets,
Yes.
which
Yeah.
are more profitable, and for the next few years will sort of dominate over any local tariffs.
Yeah.
So it's how you balance all those things together. It becomes a very complex optimization piece.
Yeah.
And you have to be aware of all of the implications of those different signals and how you actually optimize each asset. And if you try and scale that up across many different sites where all of those signals are different, it becomes an enormous headache. So that's why I'm saying you need to have all of that data, because that's what's feeding into all of these optimizations, and the ability to accurately forecast and model those prices. That all has to be very transparent, straightforward, and in the same format, so that you can read it in and use it in your modeling and your optimizations, which ultimately dispatch the assets appropriately. It creates a lot more complexity. I don't think it's it's not a massive barrier.
Yeah.
It won't stop anything happening. People will get around it, and it will just make innovations come out of the market as you try and balance these different things. What I would say is you don't want to have one signal where you turn down and one signal where you turn up at the same time, and then it nets off a zero. That's somehow doing nobody any favors. So if we can have some sort of communication between the different parties involved, so that you're not getting this doing nothing and getting paid twice for it, that seems very inefficient.
I guess it's going to be quite hard to necessarily get that right, because you're going to have different charging zones at transmission and at distribution. So you may well have slightly different signals coming through. So yeah, the coordination of that. And looking in the future, Robin, in your roadmap for a really great flexible future, is there anything that you would like to see on Ofgem's list?
I would really like to see some sort of carbon price signal. The idea that you have something that's net zero competing directly with diesel generators, it seems a bit mad. And if we could somehow regulate away from that, then that would be a good thing.
So that's a carbon signal in the flexibility markets.
Yeah. And also I would say some certainty, some long-term certainty, which enables investment, so that we can accurately forecast a business revenue stack over 10 years and have some confidence that in 2 years' time, for example, that is actually going to be the case. And that will enable investor confidence, which at the end of the day will enable more projects to be built.
Great. Thank you, Robin. We're nearing the end, but I was wondering whether any of our panelists, actually, John, coming back to you, whether you had any questions for our panelists or any sort of responses you wanted to make to some of their points.
A lot of really valid points, lots of which we are aware of, but getting more insight and evidence on them is always useful. Particularly, I guess pick up Paul's. Paul's example of distortions was exactly the sort of thing we had in mind, but it is quite rare to hear people actually confessing to them or giving evidence of them. So it is useful to hear. I guess just to pick up on Robin's point about carbon signals, I think we absolutely agree that is an issue, and it's something we're talking to BEIS about. At the moment, it's more in their policy area in terms of carbon pricing. So that's, I think, what we're talking to them for. But I guess if need be, we'll have to think about other options there. But yeah, absolutely, it does feel like there's a big missing signal there, which needs to be addressed quite urgently.
So one of my final questions, because we do have, I think, quite a lot of local authorities, community energy groups on the call today. Quite a lot of these signals are top down, essentially. They're sort of based on what the networks already have. They're based on national policy decisions. Into the future, Regen have been pushing this as an angle, and we actually did a paper with Spen looking about the regional and local sort of influences on on network and how network develops in their area. And do you think that that angle has been reflected enough in the SCR? Is there more that could be done to have the sort of locally influenced? I guess I'm thinking of, there may be areas where local authorities really want to have more generation, and they're going to be under a primary that has a generation with a big charge. How is that going to interact, the sort of political interactions between the SCR and what local authorities and communities might want to achieve, or even devolved governments?
Yeah, it's a really tricky one. It's not an easy solution. I mean, it is a national methodology that we have to set. I mean, we do, a lot of what we're trying to do is reflecting local variations, but once you get into, I mean, I guess if charging areas were mapped exactly according to the democratic mandates of these local authorities, then it'd probably be a bit of an easier question because you'd feel more comfortable. But often that's not the case, and say a DNO region could map different local authorities, and so if one local government wants to do something that increases costs, that could be pushing up costs for those outside of that area. So that's a really difficult bit to navigate within all of this. And so I don't think I mean, it's something we're aware of, and we would welcome further discussions on it, but we don't have a magic bullet on it.
That's great. So thank you very much. We are going to go to our final poll question before we close. So we want to know how people feel about what they've heard and whether or not they think that the proposals are going to be good for decarbonisation. So you're going to be asked a question: do you think it's going to be very negative, mainly negative, a bit of both, mainly positive, or very positive? And I'm really hoping people don't sit in the middle, but I'm suspecting they might. I'll give you a few moments to fill that out. Okay, I'm going to trust Hannah to end this when she's had enough people voting. Okay, right. That's interesting. So our winner is mainly negative, but we do have, on balance, actually, I don't want to go to Trump too much. On balance, it does look either a bit of both or mainly positive. If you add those together, they were slightly more positive than negative, I think. But anyway, it's really interesting to see that spread of what people have taken away. I mean, my view, if anyone values it, is that it is a bit of both at this stage. And I guess what we've said all along really is that the devil is in the detail. And so it could be positive for one site and negative for another, if you're talking about renewable generation. And really, until we've got those charges down in black and white, we don't really know who's going to be sitting in which pot. So it's quite an interesting question. So it's going to be key to be able to work out those actual prices when we get those through. So I'm going to bring that to a close now, and just wanted to say, if you have any useful evidence for John and the team, please do get in touch. We will be sending around the slides that have the contact details on them. Also, keep an eye out for the consultation, and we hope that you'll be able to respond to that. We're going to highlight when that is to our members or our ESN members and through our newsletters, etc. So stay in touch and we will let you know when that will happen. So it just means I need to say thank you to our speakers. So thank you very much to the panel, to Graham, Paul, Robin, and to John. And thank you to everybody else for joining, and goodbye.